if I'm smart enough to realize that whatever authority that has comes from a higher source, and if I say, this may destroy me, but if the destruction, if my obedience to that runs counter to the communication from the source of its energy, then certainly the thing that made that can more than destroy me. It can more than destroy the physical. It can destroy my relationship with that source. See if I can say it another way. If my body being hurt causes me pain, and because I am afraid of the pain that hurting my body can cause me, I avoid doing something that I know that I should do. I've been commanded by God to do this, but I know that my body will hurt and it will give me pain. Then I can obey my body and its fear of pain, and thus disobey the source that has told me to do something. I have made for myself a lesser ruler. And by obeying that lesser ruler, I have ignored the law or the communication from the greater ruler. And so I am subject to that lesser law, and I am hurt. If, on the other hand, I recognize it is true, this law says that I will be hurt if I do that, but the source of that law is telling me, do it anyway, and it is the source of the ability of this to hurt me, then I go to that higher source and expect that his control over this result will remove it as a ruling factor in my life. All of that may be very difficult to understand, but that's what I see as the thinking process of these people. Why should I be afraid of a being who is given his life, his authority, and his power by God? The statement itself, in fact, is repeated again in the New Testament when Peter faced the priests of the Sanhedrin. He said essentially the same to them. They said to him, if you don't follow our edict, the same thing will happen to you that happened to Jesus Christ. And he was really tickled by that. He was absolutely delighted by that threat, because it gave him an opportunity to experience what Christ had experienced. Essentially, he said to them, if you really could do to me what you did to Christ, then I should thank you for it, because what you did to him was removed him from a single body. He was in one place, he had one voice, and he could do his work just in one location until you destroyed his body. But when he was no longer in that one single location, he was suddenly alive in me, alive in John, alive in the others, and now instead of one body, he had at least 12. And if you call that destruction, by all means, do it to me. You know, he was wide open to it. He also said to them, you only have the power to do this to me for as long as God is pleased to let you live. And if I am obeying God, and you're threatening me, and you're saying you must stop obeying God or I will kill you, then I have to be aware that you may be able to kill my body, but it was God that gave you life and God that gave my body life. And if I'm obeying God and you destroy my body, he's perfectly capable of giving me a new one. So do your worst. You've only given me a choice in whether I obey you or obey God. And that decision is an obvious one. I will obey God. So we have this same response these two different times, and it communicates something that I think might be important for us to hear now. You know, we might think, in our day and time, we don't get put in these positions. I mean, we don't get threatened with fiery furnaces. The government doesn't say you have to stop worshiping. We don't really get this chance to stand up for God and say, I'm going to worship anyway. And yet, the essence of this challenge is with you every day. You have the opportunity to obey God and go ahead and say something or do something that is important and makes a difference, but there is a lesser authority that speaks to you and that says, if you do obey God, it's going to cost you money. Or if you do obey God, look what it's going to do to your reputation. If you do obey God, look what's going to happen to you within the community. Look at the inconvenience that you will cause yourself, and we may wind up obeying the lesser authority. And if we do, we lose the opportunity for that direct relationship with the source of the authority that we were speaking to. Even that which threatens me, even that which threatens my security, was given its ability to do so by a cause. If I can go beyond the lesser authorities to a greater authority, if I can come from the bottom of the tree, as we've drawn it this week, if I can come from the foundation and pass to the kingdom and quit thinking from the foundation, if I quit thinking that it is the kingdom that rules me, it is, of course, but if I see that the source of energy of that kingdom comes from the highest point on the tree, then I can look past the kingdom and say, I will be ruled by that, or I will be ruled by that, and we lift our consciousness beyond the limitation of what appears to be what is controlling our life to the source of its ability to control our life. And through doing that, we lift our consciousness from foundation to kingdom. Then kingdom is no longer the source of the law that rules over me, but the balance in the center of the tree is the law that rules over that. And I've lifted my consciousness there. Now I see a new law. And if I blend myself, become one with that new law, that center of balance within the tree, then I look upon the source of its energy, a new law still, a second new law. I move to the lesser face of God, and I begin to understand or relate to the unknowable face of God. And the laws then have changed again and again. Things that I considered impossible are no longer impossible. Things that were not understandable are now understandable. But if I look from foundation to kingdom and try to find in kingdom the laws of the universe, I will only find the kingdom laws that relate to foundation. I will not find the Tiphereth laws that relate to kingdom or the Keter laws that relate to Tiphereth. I am looking from the wrong end of the spectrum to try to find the cause factor. So this is the situation that the people found themselves in coming back into Israel. They came back without their language. And there were only a few people who retained the knowledge of that language. Only one or two came back from Babylon. But there was a group of people in the meantime. As the people were led away into Babylon, there were a few people who had hidden themselves in caves, which had become a tradition by now. You remember, if we go all the way back to Samuel, and we're going back hundreds of years now, before the kingdom of Israel was actually established, Samuel had set up little camps of students, the schools of the prophets, in at least 3 different areas of Israel. And in each one of these places, through the periods of the kings, it seems like every other generation, at least, there is a threat to these people. The temporal rulers attempt to wipe out the religious faction because the people of Israel were so much led by their prophets and by their religion that the temporal ruler, the king, very often lost his authority to the prophets. So there was this war, constant war going on between the king and the prophets. And the king, having the army, would threaten the prophets quite regularly. And so they had established for themselves caves along the Jordan and up in Carmel, and over and over and over again, the prophets are disappearing into the caves, sometimes 50s and 100s at a time, hiding. When Israel went into the Babylonian captivity, the same thing happened. So the prophets had hid in the caves, and all during this 400 years, the teaching in the school of the prophets continued. There are still men studying Kabbalah. There are still men keeping the language itself alive. Still men working with the alphabet and internalizing within themselves the secrets of the energy, the life, the character hidden in the Hebrew characters. And they kept it there, the men of the mountain, as they were called at the time. And they survived this captivity intact and continued to keep the faith of Israel alive. Now, as the nation is beginning to reestablish itself, they set up the court of the 70 rulers or judges, and Nehemiah reestablishes the government and the worship, and Alexander takes over or conquers Egypt and the Persian Empire and declares himself to be a pharaoh. Interesting process this, because Alexander was a man who had studied the knowledge of Greece, and in those pseudo-mystery schools, I call them pseudo-mystery schools because the mysteries that they had there were corruptions of the Egyptian mysteries, but Alexander learned that. He learned that the source of the mysteries that he studied in Greece was in Egypt, and that if he really wanted to become the supreme initiate, he must be initiated by the teachers of the mystery schools in Egypt. So when he conquered Egypt, he went there, and he presented himself to study with the master magi of Egypt. And they did teach him some things, but they were not about to actually allow this Greek to become a genuine pharaoh. They allowed him to call himself that. They allowed the coronation and all of the trappings and rituals of power, but the keys of power, the initiation keys, were not really given to him. And he even went so far as to build into the great mystery school at Luxor, the temple in Man that we looked at the other night. He reconstructed it and put in his Greek images and his Greek style of architecture in order to sort of apparently impress the people that he had the secret of the temple to make it his and to become the Pharaoh initiate of Egypt. In attempting to establish this, he considered it important to gather the great wisdom literature of the world, the ideas of all of the great initiates. And so he went throughout the empire and attempted to bring the sacred books, the sacred teachings, and the sacred teachers to Egypt and establish a new city and build a great library at Alexandria, which he hoped would rival the ancient library that had been at Heliopolis. He devoted a great part of his life to this gathering of wisdom literature and wisdom information. And his successors then, the Ptolemies and Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies, all continued in this tradition to some extent, where Alexander attempted to establish the great Alexandrian library. So then the Ptolemy coming after him attempted to establish the great library at Memphis. And we have here perhaps the first government subsidized education, in the sense that Ptolemy declared to the people that any man who could mass wisdom literature from anywhere in the world and could amass that for a library, he would build for them a college and a library around their collection of books. So there became collections of books here and there as the adventurers went out and gathered the books from all over the world to build this great university at Memphis. And it was he who made the arrangement with the Sanhedrin in Israel to bring the wisdom literature of Israel. This is now the Torah and the collected writings since the Torah that had become the law and the prophets. All of these then were brought to Egypt, but they were written in this ancient Hebrew script, and nobody could read them. There was, in fact, nobody within the Sanhedrin, nobody within the governors of Israel, the high priest himself, could not read it, because his language was Aramaic, and only to the extent that he knew what the text said could he actually unfold these characters and put the text together. It was hopeless. They couldn't get a translation, an accurate translation from Hebrew into Greek. But there was a way out. These men of the mountain who had become the expectant ones, the pregnant people, they began to call themselves the pregnant people because they were expecting the Messiah. So they were pregnant with the expectation of the Messiah that they were reading about in their literature. They had kept the language alive, and they were taken into Egypt and separated one from the other so that they couldn't collaborate, because if they were allowed to collaborate, perhaps they would distort the whole translation and they would translate something that wasn't there at all. So they were separated so that they couldn't talk with one another. And they did, in fact, make the translation, but they were very careful in making their translation to use systems that had been alive in Israel for years. One of the things that the men in the schools of the prophets had learned is how to tell stories. And this is one of the most important elements of ancient Judaism. When the rabbi was teaching the young men, the teaching technique, the most important, single most important teaching technique of ancient Israel was to take a concept and make a story, perhaps a fable, but usually it was historical story, so that it had characters, and they illustrated the moral of their story. They illustrated the teaching. And in these stories of the rabbis, everything had a meaning. A serpent had a meaning, a bear had a meaning, a temple builder had a meaning, a shepherd had a meaning. And these became archetypal characters that were part of these stories that the rabbis used to convey their meaning. And if one knew that shepherd means a man who shepherds his thoughts, a person who takes responsibility for where each thought comes from, instead of the person whose mind is like sheep without a shepherd, where the thoughts simply pop into the mind at random, and the person can't control their mind. They think about things that they don't want to think about. An idea or a fear comes into their head, and they can't get rid of it because their thoughts are like sheep wandering without a shepherd, and one follows the next one, so that when a train of thought starts, all of the thoughts go right behind it. So if that first thought is a thought of fear, then the thoughts in the mind line up as thoughts of fear, and the fear increases, and all of their thoughts, like sheep without a shepherd, are following that one fear thought, and they can't get it out of the mind. So that is the man of the undisciplined mind with like sheep without a shepherd, as opposed to the shepherd, a man who directs his thoughts deliberately, who feeds them and waters them, and his thoughts grow appropriately in a healthy way. He is a meditator. He is a man with a disciplined mind, and he gives the first fruits of his thoughts to God. The tenth of his sheep, or the first and most beautiful of his lambs, is given to God. All of this is embodied in that expression, shepherd. So if there's a story of a shepherd, then those who have grown up on these stories using these archetypal images will understand the story. But if a person is from another culture and they read this story, they are only reading the story of a shepherd, and they wonder, what in the world does this mean? A shepherd gave a sacrifice to God, and a man who was a planter gave a sacrifice to God, and God accepted the shepherd's sacrifice, and God did not accept the planter's sacrifice. And these poor Egyptians or Greeks sitting there reading this story in Greek get, of course, the understanding that God likes shepherds better than planters, and that God is obviously not a vegetarian. He wanted the sheep and not the vegetables. The story doesn't make sense unless you understand the archetypal energies that are used. So these men decided, instead of literally translating the story, we will use the archetypal images and we'll still tell the same story. We will be true and faithful to the text, but by means of using archetypal images which fit the context and still tell the story. So they accurately translated the entirety of the Old Testament and spoke of 7 ages as 7 days, or 7 worlds, essentially, as 7 days. They told the story of Adam and Eve, where the story was of archetypal man. They made him a person, a man and a woman, and their sons. And over there is the story of the initiate giving birth to a realization or an idea. But when they speak of that idea, they speak of his wife giving birth to a son, and they give a name to the son that is the characterization of the idea that they want to communicate. And so all of this is translated into Greek and is called the Pentateuch, called the Septuagint, the work of the 70, it's called. Which people argue about. Some of them say that it means that the members of the Sanhedrin court signed it, and they were the 70. Others say that they were 70 Essene scholars who actually did the translation, and either one of those may be true, or both may be true. More important is the value of the number 7 as being a completed spiritual work. So it was the completion of this spiritual work, the work of the 70, the accomplishment was added to infinity and was given then to the world. And you have this Greek book which tells a number of ridiculous stories about a very angry and bloodthirsty God causing people to battle and kill one another, and doesn't appear to be wisdom literature at all. I'm really intrigued with what the librarians in Egypt must have thought when they received this and began to read these stories. What kind of wisdom literature is this? What kind of nation does it come from? It's enough to give the Jews a bad name. But this was the creation of the source of the Bible that you study. And it seems to me that unless we become familiar with this tradition of teaching by stories, stories that have morals, and one of the examples of that is the book of Ruth. This entire book does not contain any teaching about God. It doesn't contain the word God. It doesn't contain any spiritual instruction other than a story with a moral. A story of a family that finds Israel in famine, a time lacking in prosperity. They go through the Great Depression in Israel, and these people decide we'll go over to Moab and live during this period, so we'll be prosperous there. And the story sort of begins by saying this man and woman and their sons, their 2 sons, are more concerned with feeding themselves than with building the nation. And so, being disloyal to their country and its need to build its own economy, they go over into Moab and go to work there, and the 2 sons marry wives there. And while they're there, the father and the 2 sons die and leave Naomi the wife and mother, with her 2 daughters-in-law. Now we have 3 widows living together, the mother-in-law in a foreign country, and the 2 young widows not able to care for her, and needing, in fact, to find themselves another husband among their people so that they can be cared for. So Naomi calls them together and says to the 2 of them, "You're young, you're beautiful, you can be married again, you have a life ahead of you, stay here in your country and build your life, and I have disobeyed God, I've disobeyed my people, I've not been loyal to Israel, but I must return there. Nobody is responsible for me in this country, and if I stay here, I'll die. So I'll attempt to return to Israel." And Ruth says to her then, and this becomes probably the most important of the morals of the story. Although the rabbis were great at putting 10, 12, 15, or 200 morals in one story. There is this, there's this, there's this, and when you take it apart, it's just full of teachings that they were giving to these young boys in their schools there. But the whole thing focuses on Ruth's response. When she says to her mother-in-law, "Entreat me not to leave thee or forsake thee. For whither thou goest, I will go. Wherever thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, thy God, my God. And may God destroy me, or worse, if I fail to live up to this vow." So she was not bound by law or even by any moral code to take care of her mother-in-law. The other daughter-in-law did as Naomi requested. She went out and married again and lived in her own country, and no more is heard of her. But Ruth says, "First of all, I'll look after you. I'll go with you to Israel and make sure that you survive, and because I can't abandon you. I can't let an old woman try to travel back by herself and perhaps die. I'll go with you, and whatever that requires of me, I will live up to it." And so this vow of caring for another becomes the central focus of the story. And in fact, the story goes on to speak of how she is rewarded for the faithfulness of this vow. As she goes into Israel with her mother-in-law and gives her life, she receives life even greater. Not only does she become wealthy through marriage, but more important perhaps, she becomes another one of the women in the lineage of Jesus Christ. So although not a Jew, she becomes a grandmother of Jesus Christ. And 2 things happen here which I think are important. One is that she is, by virtue of her love and her commitment, she becomes a part of the chosen people and becomes, in a sense, a Jewess that is greater than a Jewess because of birth, but because of her commitment, because of her consciousness, she becomes one of the circumcision, one of the chosen people. But at the same time, it makes an opportunity for Jesus to be universal. He had a grandmother who was not Jewish by birth. And so there is an added dimension in both ways there as a result of the life of this woman. There is another illustration there that I think is probably important, and it is that by law during that period, if a person was sold into bondage, if they gave their life into bondage because they couldn't pay their debts, they essentially became a servant of a family for life so that they could eat. And that's what Naomi and Ruth had done. When they came back to Israel, they gave themselves in bondage to a family so that they could survive. And virtually they became bondslaves. The law in Israel said that any kinsman of a bondslave could redeem that commitment, could take them out of their slavery if he himself was not in bondage to someone else. By being a kinsman and by not having a debt in which he was obligated to work for someone else, he could claim responsibility for the care of these people and so end their contract for bondage. And so he did. Boaz took the daughter, married her, and took the mother-in-law as well, and led them out of bondage, which becomes an illustration of what the Messiah will do. So that this story is not only the story of people unfaithful to their land, a story of the commitment of love and all of these other morals, but also becomes an allegory of the Messiah. A man who is not in bondage, according to Hebrew law, can lead the nation out of the bondage that it has sold itself into by making love to the alternate lover. So it becomes, once again, a chapter in the story of the divine lover. And the adulterous bride who has made love to riches and fame and fortune and so has put herself in bondage to it. She has a relative, a kinsman, who comes and is not in bondage to sin himself. Because he is not, he can claim his bride out of her house of bondage, marry her, and she becomes free. So it becomes an allegory of the relationship of the Messiah to Israel. The stories then, so structured, had become the teaching method of Israel, and was a part of the way that the Kabbalah was revealed, that difficult teachings were made simpler by illustrating them in these stories. And using that technique, these translators could hide from the uninitiated, could hide from the unbeliever, the meaning that the believer could so obviously take out of it, if in fact he was one of those who grew up with these stories and these allegories and traditions. And so the Bible was translated in that manner, using these allegorical teachings to both hide and reveal truth at the same time, depending on the consciousness of the reader. And this happens during the rule of the Ptolemies. Cleopatra was the successor to the Ptolemies, and she was bit by the same bug as Alexander and her grandfather, the first of the Ptolemies, and she wanted to also be famous for reinstituting the mystery schools of Egypt, and one of her predecessors, Alexander the Great, had attempted to do that in Alexandria. Another had attempted to do it in Memphis. And now she decided that the most sacred of the sites was Heliopolis, the city of the sun. And it is there that I want to reestablish the great library of Heliopolis. And so she began to build there, rebuild the temple of Heliopolis. And at the time, the puppet ruler of Israel now is Herod the Great, or Herod the First, a man who had earned for himself a title, friend of Caesar. He had been a great general, and because of being a great general, he was awarded the governorship or kingship of one of the puppet states. Not that he was of that state. He wasn't, in fact. He had been the son of an Edomian chieftain from the Edomian tribe, and that wasn't very Jewish, and the Jewish people didn't like having a puppet ruler put over them that was of the Edomian people. But then he was part Jewish, and he used that to try to win the hearts of the people of Israel. It's an interesting story, especially because this man was, in fact, a great man in many ways. He was a great architect, he was a great builder, he was a great general, he was even a great statesman. And had he been put in charge of any other nation in the world, he probably would have gone down in history as one of the great men of history. But to put before anybody the challenge of ruling the Jewish people of that time while being a non-Jew, was something that requires more than greatness. It requires more than being a statesman. It requires more than being a general. It requires more than even being a wise man. He appeared to be all of those things. Not only that, he was actually a man who attempted to be kind and fair in ruling the Jewish people. Did his darndest to make friends with them. All sorts of things. He would promote their festivals. He would cooperate with their priests. He did everything that he could do to win the hearts of these people. He wanted to be a great ruler. He wanted Caesar to know that he could keep peace among his people. But one thing that they couldn't get over is he's not Jewish, and he's not of Israel. We didn't choose him. We didn't make him our king. He is a puppet of Rome, and as long as we hate Rome, we're going to hate him no matter how nice he is. So with that kind of consciousness, there were times when he absolutely gave up and didn't make any attempt to be kind to the people, and then he would try to make up for that, and he went back and forth a little bit. Toward the end of his life, he wasn't quite so nice or so friendly. He had given up his statesmanship then, no longer cared about being friends of the Jewish people. He had decided that's impossible. Nobody can be a friend of Jewish people, he had decided, but he still wanted to be a friend of Caesar. Now, in fact, he had been a great supporter of Julius Caesar against Mark Antony. And this became a problem when Mark Antony became the Caesar, because all of a sudden he had to reverse his allegiance. But he did so very, very well. As soon as it was obvious that that Mark Antony would become the ruler, he switched his loyalties, but not until. He was loyal until the end, and in fact that was one of the marks of his relationship with Rome, was that he was absolutely loyal to the Caesar that he served at any given time. But he sent a message to Mark Antony and explained to him, it's not a matter of whether I am a friend of Julius Caesar or a friend of yours. I am a friend of the Caesar who is ruling, and my loyalty will be to you now that you are Caesar as much as it was to Julius Caesar when he was Caesar. And this communication was understood by Mark Antony, and in fact he once more awarded him with the highest title that Rome gave, which was a title called Friend of the Caesar. Now, at the same time, you know about all of the intrigue with Queen Cleopatra, who is trying to rebuild her temple in Egypt. She wants to be a great ruler too, and she knows that the best way to do that is to be a friend of whatever Caesar happens to be ruling at the moment. But she also knew that being a beautiful woman, she could use that to lure some cooperation with other people as well. One of those people happened to be the great warrior Herod. And so she spent a little time making up to Herod and trying to have a love relationship with him that would allow her to have some of the coastal cities of Israel. She figured if we get a really good relationship going, then Israel and Egypt will sort of blend, and I will have rulership not only over the coastal cities of Egypt, which really is just at the mouth of the Nile, but my rulership will extend up this eastern side of the Mediterranean. Except that Herod was wise enough to know, if I have an affair with Cleopatra, there's no way to hide that from Mark Antony, and I will be in a world of trouble. So he refused her advances, and you know what they say, hell hath no fury like, and she was determined to prove that point. And so she went to Mark Antony and sort of reversed the story. She, instead of saying that she had come on to Herod, she told Mark Antony that Herod had come on to her, and tried to insult his manhood and make sure that he would take care of Herod. And explained that what she really wanted was coastal cities of Israel, and as much as that, she wanted some of the famous balsam bushes and spice bushes from the banks of the Jordan that the Essene gardeners were so famous for cultivating and raising. She wanted that great medicinal herb garden to surround her new temple in Heliopolis. And so Mark Antony, his manhood being challenged, was about to go after Herod, but Herod had, this is one of the reasons he was such a great general. He had assumed that if he had spurned Cleopatra, that her first move would be to go to Herod, so he sent a messenger to Caesar. So he sent a messenger to Caesar on the assumption that she had done exactly what she did. This man was not only a great general, he knew women, particularly this woman. Knowing exactly what she would do, he sent a messenger to get there ahead of her and to explain to Mark Antony what had really happened. And of course he made sure that the messenger carried with him the bulk of the gold of Israel as a gift to Mark Antony. So Mark Antony sent a message back to Herod that said, essentially, I understand the problem, but you know how it is with women, we have to appease her in some way, so why don't we just give her the rulership of a couple of cities of Israel along the coast, and give her a great gift of gardens, of balsam bushes and spice bushes, the things that she wants, and see if she will be appeased. So Herod went to the Essene community and ordered that the balsam bushes and spice bushes from the gardens there should be transferred to Egypt along with gardeners to care for them. And so a group of Essene gardeners, along with their spice bushes, were shipped off to Heliopolis in Egypt to become a part of her sacred garden there. Which is, in fact, an interesting thing, because by virtue of their being there, they established a small Essene community in Heliopolis, just in time to have that Jewish Essene community established as a place where Jesus the Christ would grow up just a generation later. So those seeds are planted for the coming of the Christ to Egypt, and the people that he would live with and the Essene teachers who would teach him in his youth were transferred there by God's design, working through love affairs and intrigue of Rome and Egypt and Herod in Israel. So I think we've brought us just about to the end of the Old Testament for the moment. We're going to take a break and we'll come back and take some questions. We have some written questions. I think we'll take those first, and then we'll take questions from you if you like. The first one says, the threshing stone, or the rock of Moriah, was at times called the foundation stone. Was this physically positioned under the foundation of the Kabbalah tree of life between the two pillars of the temple? Are not the two identical? Yes. The rock that we're referring to is called Mount Moriah. It is the rock that is now the central figure in the dome of the rock, which is a mosque at the present time. But it was the rock that was in front of the two pillars of the temple at the time of Solomon's temple. And this rock was used in a very special way. When the evening sacrifices were done at the moment of sundown, I've already described this ritual. It became actually more elaborate when the temple was built. So I described it at the time of the tabernacle. At the time of the temple, there were trumpets positioned on the roof of the temple, the pinnacles of the temple. And at precisely the moment when the sun disappeared over the horizon, the last rim of the sun, those trumpets were blown. At exactly the same moment of the blowing of the trumpet, the priests and the people gathered there finished their quotation from the book of Exodus, which said, "And let the people of Israel kill it." And with the word "kill," and the blast of the trumpets, the knife that was held by the priests came down across the throat of the sacrifice. And then an interesting thing was done. The sacrifice, the lamb itself, was lifted to God and then to the left and to the right, so that the origin of the sign of the cross was not in the Catholic Church but was in the Hebrew temple. And the sign of the cross was made at the taking of the life of the sacrifice. The blood from the throat of the sacrifice was caught in a golden bowl by one of the priests, and it was passed down the line of priests from hand to hand until they came to this rock, which was the rock of Mount Moriah, and the blood was poured over the surface of the rock. The rock was considered at that time to be the center of the world, and the thought, the esoteric thought was that the blood of the sacrifice ran down over the stone and into the earth to redeem the earth itself, or the foundation, which is earth. The pillars of the temple then rose up from that, and those two pillars, the pillar of Joachim and Boaz, or Jachin and Boaz, were the two pillars of the tree of life. The entranceway to the temple then, between them, was the center pillar of the tree of life, the pillar of beauty between the temple, the pillars of severity and mercy. So the foundation was the place where man lives, at the base of the tree, the kingdom, the foundation, being the earth and the entrance into the next higher state of consciousness or higher world. So that as a person went from the rock of sacrifice into the temple, they went from the base of the tree of life to the crown at the Holy of Holies, which was entered only once a year, was kept in darkness, and was the place where only the high priest, and the high priest, of course, was the figure of Tipperet, going across the darkness into the Holy of Holies to approach the crown or Kether. And beyond that, of course, beyond Kether, in the Tree of Life is the Ein Sof Or, the radiation of light that rises from it. And this was symbolized as an extension of the center pillar by the pillar of fire and smoke, the radiation of the light of the presence of God, or the Shekinah. And the Shekinah then is a result of these two opposing forces meeting one another. And where the opposing forces meet, they precipitate and cause an energy manifestation, which is this pillar of fire that takes the consciousness, the prayers rising on incense from the temple, go through that pillar and, as the ancients said, into the nostrils of God as sweet-smelling incense. So that's the rock. Also, when cave is given in the Bible, what does this refer to in consciousness? The cave is the symbol of the womb. And the womb is where the prophets returned to, where they went into the belly of the earth, or into the belly of the earth mother for renewal. So retreating into the cave and coming out again is being reborn. So they withdrew from the threatening forces of life, renewed themselves, and came back out with new life. And this is the regeneration. So the regeneration of Elijah was in the cave. And the teaching of the prophets in the schools of the prophets, they were taken in by 50s. The sensory man, the physical man, is the number 5. They came back out completed by 70s. They came out. So it's regeneration, going into the womb to regenerate the self. Also, you go into the cave when you go into meditation, into the belly of the earth. There you are renewed and come out in new life. So a cave is also a baptism. What is the significance of Nehemiah going counterclockwise, and the only standing gate of the 12 gates was Watergate? Whose question is this? She's been doing her homework. I had to rush back there on the break and find out how she knew that he went counterclockwise. Go. What did you do? Take the gates of the city and follow them around?
Well, I heard a teaching from some book, I don't even know, where there were, I heard a teaching where there were 12 gates, whatever that is, and the remaining gate was the water gate. And he
Okay.
went, and I think he went counterclockwise.
Yes, he did go counterclockwise, but it took me a while to establish that. I had to sit back there and figure out where all the gates were and which direction he went and which gate he came to next. And sure enough, he went counterclockwise. Okay. I don't know a particular reason why the Watergate was the one left standing, because there's not a great significance to that gate. The most significant gate was called the Beautiful Gate, which was the gate that went directly into the temple. But when Jerusalem was destroyed, they actually plowed the ground, so they attempted to level absolutely everything. The only thing that was left standing during the Babylonian captivity was one of the 12 gates of Jerusalem, which was called the Water Gate. If there's a significance to that, I would think that it is that water was carried from the spring, from the well of life. So the one thing that was left was the entranceway where the well that yields up the water of life was brought into the city. So it was the obvious gate to give new life to the city. As they rebuilt it, they did rebuild the 12 gates. And when Nehemiah dedicated the city, they started at that gate, the Water Gate, and they went around it in a clockwise motion, which first of all took them east. So they went east toward the coming of the sun, which they equated with the coming of life force. The Hebrews always did one of two things. When Jerusalem was standing and the temple was there, they always prayed facing Jerusalem. When Jerusalem was not standing, and they were, for example, in Babylon, the Babylonian captivity, they prayed facing east. So it was either facing Jerusalem or facing east. The coming of the sun, the coming of light, is the coming of the Messiah. So they went east from the Water Gate in going to each of the gates of the city to bless each one as they rebuilt it. There may be a further significance in going counterclockwise in that energy descends in a clockwise motion. If you are working with the tree of life, the energy comes out of Kether and to the pillar of mercy first and around, so that the spiral is clockwise as the energy descends to earth. Energy ascending from earth goes in the opposite direction, the counterclockwise spiral, back to its source. So they were taking the energy upward from earth in a counterclockwise direction. Also, the snake that eats its tail, the alphabet of Israel, is counterclockwise, reading from right to left instead of from left to right. So if that is the way that creation comes, then they were following the steps of creation in recreating the city. The second question, covenant. What is a covenant from God? And in the notes there were 3 steps. God renews and enlarges the covenant with Abraham, speaks to Jacob and renews the covenant again, and makes a covenant with Noah. The word covenant itself means a contract or an agreement. And the covenant of Israel was the bond between the source and the people that allowed for both of them fulfilling an agreement that makes them one. By my commitment to my source, I gain the energy of the source to return to source. And it is that agreement that is the covenant. But it's more than that. The covenant is an agreement, but there is an energy or a power that is inherent in the keeping of that covenant. And even if I am unable to keep it, the spirit of the covenant being devoted to it, by my consciousness being devoted to the spirit of the covenant, even if I can't keep the letter of it, creates an energy of regeneration. So The covenant is really the vital force behind the agreement that allows for regeneration by my commitment to it. Are there any ancient mystery schools today? If so, how does one become acquainted with them? Well, first of all, there are mystery schools today, and the mysteries themselves are ancient, so I suppose they qualify as ancient mystery schools. As far as becoming acquainted with them, I think the best way to answer that is something like this. The teachings of the mystery schools were very carefully hidden until the moment of the rending of the veil of the temple at the crucifixion of the Christ. From that moment until this, the hidden teachings have been made open to anyone who is sufficiently prepared to receive them. So, in a sense, the rules of the mystery schools were changed at that moment. Prior to that moment, the person who was accepted into a mystery school had to be discovered. There was really nothing that they could do on their own to be accepted into a mystery school. Remember, we talked about how a student came to a mystery school in that time, and in essence it was that when a child, very early in life, if a child was inclined to dream, and to talk about his dreams, and if those dreams seemed to be deep and significant, and if the thoughts of that child, his words and his attitudes, seemed to carry a natural bent toward the mystical, then the child was thought of as a candidate for this quality of teaching. And if he was discovered then, either by his parents or by people in the community that just recognized the natural mystical bent of that child, they were usually taken to the priest. The priest usually then referred them to the prophets or somebody from the school, and eventually they landed in the school. They were discovered, in other words. Since the rending of the veil, the hidden teachings are no longer as literally hidden. Now, they still are hidden. They are hidden now to anyone who has not taken the prior degree to receiving them. Interestingly, the teachings of the mystery schools are not as arcane or as complex or difficult to understand as you might think. But the intellectual perception of them is not the power behind them. You can understand how something works and still not be able to work it because you have not claimed mastery of the simpler things that you know. And perhaps the best way to give an example of that is this. The basic first step in preparation for the mystery schools is the mastery of emotion. And so you could find around you here in this group of people, you can probably find at least a dozen people here tonight who can, in perhaps a very detailed way, explain the process of mastering your emotions. They can talk about how emotions are created, what the beliefs are behind them, how to overcome those beliefs and change the emotions, how to come out of being a victim of your emotions. There are at least a dozen people who know that the key to being able to do that is a right relationship with yourself. Such a commitment to love and appreciation for what and who you are that nobody else can hurt your feelings, because it is you who establish your worth. And because you have taken such absolute responsibility for that, you feel consistently loved all the time, at every moment. And for a person to deny you love does not cause you to feel a denial of love, because you are taking that responsibility. Now, there is a very basic first step. There are hordes of people who learn about that step. There is all the difference in the world between learning about that step and learning that step. And so people learn about that step, and then they say to me and anyone else who's teaching that step, will you quit harping on that? It's all we ever hear. Somebody very recently said, I don't know if I want to come and hear Paul speak again. He always speaks on the same thing, you know. And it's quite true. I freely admit it. It's the only thing that I talk about. A right relationship with yourself brings a right relationship with your emotions. And the problem is that I have to keep talking about that until we do that, and then we can talk about the next step. So the sooner we do that, the sooner I get on to another subject, and I'll quit nagging and harping. But then once we've done that, once you see a person who has overcome the emotions and formed a right relationship with self, they are ready for the next step. And that is a right relationship with body and with mind. And now you have a person who has mastered his emotions first, he has mastered his mind next, and his mind will go anywhere he sends it. A person who has mastered his mental process can send his mind anywhere, forward in time, backward in time, to a different location in space, and can report with reasonable accuracy what is going on at that other location in space or in time, can project his thoughts into a body and describe what's going on in that body. He has mastered that step. Now, these are not secrets that are so hidden that you can't learn them. You can learn them. But you can't learn the mastery of the mind until you've learned the mastery of emotions. And so as long as you're a person who still can be hurt by any remark that I might make, whatever it is, however insulting, however unfair, if I can get to you, if I can cause you to feel an emotional reaction with anything that I do, then I can't take you the next step to talk about the mastery of the mind, because the mastery of the emotions is not complete, and it is step by step. If that first step is mastered, then you can take the next step. And if the mind is mastered, the mind tells the body what to do, and the mastery of the body is the third step, which is fairly simple once those first two steps. There's no point in talking about the third step when the first step is only learned about but not learned. I know how to do it, but I'm not doing it. Will you take me the next step? Love to, but it wouldn't do you any good because you would only know about it. You wouldn't know it. And you can learn about all of the steps that were given in the ancient mystery schools, and you still will only know about it. The initiate is the one who learned it instead of learning about it. The mystery schools are still alive, and the steps to entering them are available to anyone who has ears to hear, which is what that statement means. Over and over and over in the Bible, you'll hear this statement, let him who has ears to hear, let him hear. Those people who have ears to hear are those who recognize that I have to learn the step and not just about the step in order to make the step. And if I learn that, the next step is also revealed to me, and the next. And when a person does make those basic steps, then having mastered the emotions, the body, and the mind, his next step is to master the atmosphere or the environment around him. Then he can affect externals. He can affect the weather. He can affect the growth of plants. He can affect the energies of the environment which may be hostile. He can turn them from hostility into a different kind of energy. When he has done that, he will create such a light where he is that the master teachers of the mystery schools are drawn to him. And he may not be taken away to the mountains of Tibet or somewhere in a hidden place, but the teachers will appear wherever he goes, and one will give him something here and somebody else there. He will be taken to them, they will be brought to him, and his life becomes a collection of the masters of the mystery school who take him the next step and the next step when he's prepared for them. They do exist. They are available for anyone who will get himself ready for the entrance exam. And the basic work, the work of the first court or the peristyle court, that's being done, and it's being done where you are. Take that, master it, and then if you want to go the next step, you can go. But to make application to the hypostyle school before you finish the peristyle school is not available to anybody, and it never was, either in ancient times or today. What was the name of the mystery school where Moses studied with the shepherd king? I believe you said it was by the Jordan. The name of the school I couldn't give you as a name because it didn't have a formal name in that way. It was Jethro's school. But the location of it was in the middle of the country of what is now Jordan at Petra, the underground city. Someone wants to get me in trouble. Why are Jews seemingly always hated? What is it about their life and culture that brings that response to them? How and what do each of us as an individual need to learn from this? It seems so sad that ancient Hebrew has been lost. Do you think some still remember? I'll take the last question first. Ancient Hebrew was lost, but is being reconstructed, and a lot of people have done some tremendous work in that reconstruction. Probably the greatest work was done by Fabre d'Olivet, a Frenchman who did acquire from the Vatican much of the original Hebrew writing of the Old Testament. And by using both scientific methods and linguistic methods, intellectual methods, and by using channeling, by attuning himself to it, he has carefully reconstructed the meaning and, in some instances, the pronunciations of Old Testament Hebrew, and has done a very good job with it. However, there's more to it than that, and there are people who continue to research to find in the characters the meaning and the life and so on. So it's being worked on right now by some very, very devoted people who are coming up almost every day with exciting new breakthroughs in breathing life back into ancient Hebrew. It already has been done to the extent that it can be read and interpreted, translated. So that much has been done. But the mystical understanding of it is work that is still going on in a very exciting way. In my opinion, when they do finally accomplish the decoding of ancient Hebrew, they will have unlocked the Hall of Records. Because I believe that the Hall of Records is contained in Hebrew. I believe that it is contained in the book of Genesis, in the Bible, and that the things that will be physically found in the Hall of Records are also revealed in the letters and the language of the book of Genesis. The other questions. Why are Jews seemingly always hated? There is a work that might explain that if you're interested in reading about it. A man named U.S. Anderson has written a book called Three Magic Words. You'll have to read the book to find out what the three words are. But one of the statements that he makes in the book is that the light bearer always draws the antagonism of darkness. In fact, it was said of Jesus in this way: if he's a light, and he came to bring light to people in darkness, and if the people in darkness identify with the darkness, then his light shows them up. It reveals them for what they are. And when his light so starkly reveals what they don't want to see about themselves, instead of attacking what they don't like about themselves, they attack him for revealing it. And so if these people are the carriers of the light, they also draw the antagonism. That's one of the reasons. There are a number of other reasons. One of the factors is simply that the Jewish people so early in history made their relationship with the one God that through doing that they elevated their consciousness as a people and their racial identity far beyond those people who had identified with a God for this and a God for that and so on, and didn't have that focus. That was a combined focus of nationality and religion as one. We have so proudly in this country separated state and religion, and are so committed to doing that our state is not governed by our religion or is not ruled by spirit. And by doing that, we have not given ourselves that heritage and identity that they had. By having that, wherever they were dispersed, they had a strength, a pride in who they are. And maybe this is best revealed by the difference between the Egyptian mysteries and the Hebrew mysteries on this one point. The Egyptian mysteries put the gods out there in the heavens, unapproachable to man. The Hebrew mysteries said the 12 rulers of the zodiac are the 12 princes of Israel, and they are my uncles. So mysticism that was a part of their life, part of their heritage, part of their family, and so they had this name of God that was I am. By knowing who they are, they have the strength of that identification, and wherever they went, in bondage or whatever, they were successful because they had this strength of identity to draw on. Wherever a person is immediately successful, especially as an outsider, he is resented by those who in their own country cannot succeed as he succeeds. So this resentment builds. And throughout their history, they have almost always, only a few hundred years in which they were not outsiders wherever they are. The best thing that an outsider can do if he wants to be accepted and loved and sort of bland in the relationship is to be non-successful. Then it doesn't matter. People don't throw stones at you. But when you immediately become prosperous in their country, and you begin to have power and wealth, and in fact, when you respect yourselves and are proud of your heritage, then even that is taken as something antagonistic. It is egotistical, and it builds hate. There is one other factor that I think is equally important. You have to remember that when during the time of Christ, as an example, not just during this time, but throughout their history, it has been more or less true, this same attitude. The Jews of Israel considered anyone who was non-Jew to be a pig, and that was their term for them. They were swine, and they were not fit to live. They threw rocks at them, they spit on them, and the least of what they did is they would cross to the other side of the street to keep from touching them or dealing with them in any way. And this attitude, obviously, made the people who had to relate to them, who were non-Jews, caused a great deal of hate and bitterness, extremely so. In fact, this hatred was so strong in Israel that, and the determination of the people, these two factors. During the period of the Roman Empire, Israel was the only country in the Roman Empire in which the men of Israel were not drafted into the Roman army. They were not drafted into the Roman army because they could not be trusted to fight for Rome. They were too committed to Israel. And so, where there were Roman soldiers in Israel, they did not come from the people of Israel as they did in any other country. In Syria, the Roman soldiers in Syria were Syrian. They were drafted from among their people, and they policed their own people. But the soldiers in Israel were taken as mercenaries from all of the other countries. They were paid twice the pay of any other soldiers, because they were so hated and because they were so punished to be there. It was considered the worst of assignments that could be given to a Roman soldier. So they were given twice the pay, and they were given 6 months leave every year. They only served 6 months out of the year. The other 6 months they spent on holiday. So Rome did everything that they could do to make it a little bit more appealing because they were abused by men, women, and children. Children were rewarded for throwing rocks at them. So you have a combination of these two things, the resentment of their prosperity and the resentment of their self-confidence, their heritage, their belief in themselves and their God, and their antagonism and condescending attitude toward other people historically has built this antagonism. Yes?
Well, the aspect that you have not yet mentioned, the charge of deicide, that the Jews killed Christ, is believed by most Jews to be the cause of anti-Semitism.
Okay. There is possibly, there may be something to that. I don't believe that it's a major cause of anti-Semitism because anti-Semitism is as rampant among non-Christians as it is among Christians. And so that factor wouldn't explain that. Obviously, among Christians, there has been, perhaps not as much today as in history, blaming of the Jews for the death of Jesus Christ. Anyone, however, in Christianity who has ever read the story should realize that the Bible doesn't say that. It says that he was killed by all the people who rejected him, and not particularly by the Jews. However, when the Authorized Version, the King James Version of the Bible, was translated, there's an interesting thing that was done in the translation. In the original text, the Greek and Aramaic texts that were written by the original New Testament writers, there was a reference to the orthodoxy and the non-believers. And these two people, the orthodoxy, the non-believers, and the people of Rome, were referred to. Later in England, when this was translated from Greek or Aramaic, principally Greek, into English, that was translated Jews instead of Orthodox. So we have Jews writing about themselves and blaming the Jews. How could it happen? It couldn't happen. But they didn't say that. They were talking about the orthodoxy of Jerusalem that punished themselves who were also Jews. So you wind up with Jews and Gentiles and the implication that these writers were Gentiles, which they were not. They were all Jews. So through the translation of the Bible into English during the rule of King James, every place that speaks of a person who is antagonistic to Jesus Christ, the word Jews is inserted there. So the Jews were absolutely blamed for everything. So that was a result of anti-Semitism, as I see it, rather than as a cause of anti-Semitism. But obviously that's a part of it as well. More important part of the question, how and what do each of us as an individual need to learn from this? I think that you need to learn that that the light bearer always reflects light on those who don't want to see, and can be resented for it. But the question is, do I have such a strong confidence in myself, a love of myself, a love of my source, and identification with that, to make a commitment that is not based on whether I'm accepted or not, whether I'm popular or not, whether my reputation is great or not. Is God first in my life? If so, I become Israel. And I can expect to be treated like Israel is treated, or I can expect to be treated like the light bearer is treated. One illustration of this that's interesting to me, there's a young man in New York City who's a very handsome fellow. He looks like a model from a Marlboro ad, I suppose. He's very talented, great artist, makes a great deal of money. And every time that I've ever seen this man, every time, and I've seen him through quite some ups and downs, he is always smiling, always happy, and extremely friendly to everybody. Just no exceptions. He is outgoing, he is friendly, wonderful person. And yet there are people who don't like him. And I heard some people talking about him one night and expressing the reason that they don't like him. And you know, the remark was, nobody can really be that loving and friendly all the time. He's got to be a phony. And just the very fact that this man is absolutely the embodiment of love and acceptance and friendliness is resented by those people who can't duplicate the joy that he's experiencing. And so it is. If you begin to control yourself, be full of love, life, laughter, smiles, and so on, watch what happens to your family. First thing is, what are you smiling about? What are you so happy about? You are obligated to be miserable when I'm miserable. You know, if I'm down in the dumps and you come in the room smiling, that is considered unkind. You are supposed to, you know, be somber and join me in my misery. It never seems to occur to us that the reverse really should be true. It is far kinder for the miserable one to join the other in his joy than to expect the joyous one to join the miserable one in their misery. But it's not the belief system that we have. And as long as the belief system is that people who are joyous and loving and carrying the light, Israel will be scorned. Okay, those are the questions. You have some more?
If death is a downward spiral that came after the fall, why would it be that God would have said to Adam and Eve, do not touch the fruit of the middle tree in the garden on pain of death? Could they have understood the concept? Or is that in translation that something has altered the original?
Okay, the tree that they were told not to touch is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And maybe the best way to understand what that meant is through a statement from one of our early readings. When we ask for the definition of God, we ask, what is God? The response was, God is a being who can recognize good without evil as a point of reference. Now, that suggests that if I did not get so curious about evil that I have to taste of it and know what it is like, then I would know good without needing any point of reference. It is establishing that point of reference of knowing evil in order to compare it with good that is called the fall. I make a choice. In order to make the good seem good, I get into the bad in order to give it a line of demarcation, and that represents the fall. It is that they were told not to do. The middle tree is the tree of life, not the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So it's not that they were told not to touch.
Do you relate the source of the flame or the pillar of fire with the same source as the flame in the burning bush?
Yes. How?
A little more elaborate.
Well, the pillar of fire is called the Shekinah. It is the female aspect of God in relation to its positive aspect. The meeting of these two together is the cause of the fire. Now, if I could characterize that, I would call that the Kundalini of Adam Kadmon, the body of God. The Shekinah being the Kundalini fire of the positive and negative energies meeting in the center pillar of the body of God. The burning bush, on the other hand, was the positive and negative energies meeting in the body of Moses. So it was the personal Shekinah or the Kundalini fire in his body relating to the body of God. So in a sense they're the same thing, but one is personalized, one is the body of God, one is the body of man joining to God, which is what the Shekinah is. It is our contact with his spine, if you like.
Is the pillar of smoke another word like Shekinah?
It's the same thing. It's simply a part of the same phenomena. In fact, the application of it was that at night the fire is seen better, during the day the smoke is seen better, but the phenomena is the same. Okay.
In the story, well, first of all, Egypt, I believe, represents our animal nature. Is that correct?
Egypt represents being in bondage to the animal nature in most of its applications in the scripture, not all of them, but it usually refers to bondage, and bondage refers to the state of being bound in our thinking and feeling and responses by the physical and its needs. So in a sense the body is Egypt, but it is being in bondage to the body that is Egypt.
Okay, then in the story of Joseph, why did he go to live there, and why did Jacob and the other brothers have to go there for their food to get nourishment?
Okay, did everybody hear that? You heard the question? Okay, the story, remember, is an archetype story. Joseph is first with his father where he is loved. This is, you could compare it with Jesus being in heaven with his Father. He is sold into bondage, slavery, in Egypt by his brothers, and Jesus is sold into slavery in earth by the actions of his brothers. And while he is in Egypt, his brothers have to come to him to be fed. While Jesus is in earth, his brothers come to him to be fed. So it is an allegory of the life of Jesus as Christ. Back there. Way back in the back.
I've missed some sessions. I don't know if you've discussed this symbology before or not, but Joseph's coat of many colors, what is the symbology behind that, or is there?
Probably the best application of that to the story of the allegory of Jesus is that that what Jesus was all of the colors, the radiance of light, and where each of us is an individual, the Christ is the radiance of the whole light of God, or the whole spectrum of color, and it is this coat that was given to him. It was the ability to be the representative of all of the people as the Christ before God. The coat of universality, I think.
The entrance to the Holy of Holies, the curtain was a curtain of many colors.
So the coat that he wore was the curtain, or the entranceway, the veil before the Holy of Holies.
Yes. What are the first fruits that you talk about of being thoughts? Are they the first thoughts of the day, or what do you mean by the first thoughts?
The first thoughts would be the most important thing to the mind. It is what your mind dwells on. So the first fruit of the thought is what I spend my time thinking about. If my time is spent worrying about the economy and my security, then that has dominated my thinking, and in essence is the God that will rule my life and will cause results in my body. So that God will cause disease, but it's because I worshipped that God. I held him before my mind, and the first fruit of my thought was given to him. So the person whose first fruits of thought are given to worry have the result of worry in their body. But if our first fruits are of love, love is God, then if that dominates my mind, and if love dominates my thoughts, then the commitment to that will also cause a result in my earth, which brings heaven to earth.
You spoke of divination method of finding answers. Would this, if we use this frequently, would this hinder or help intuition?
Not necessarily either one, I think. I think it can help intuition from time to time. If it is used too much, then intuition doesn't develop in other ways, but it still develops. So that personally, I feel like that if I wanted to use a divination method once or here or there from time to time, I would feel comfortable about doing it. I also feel that I don't want to get my answers just that way. I want more than just yes or no answers, or more than things that I can test on an instrument. I want to develop the rest of my consciousness so that I have a running conversation with my source, more than just the techniques of divination.
Solomon was stood for wisdom, and he was one of the wise kings of Israel. But it seemed that during his time, the seeds of the destruction or the division of the country took place. How does that relate to our own story, and how trying to follow wisdom or trying to take Solomon inside of us leads to the kind of the downgrading of the Hebrew society?
Okay, I'm not sure that you can so directly blame the reign of Solomon for the division of the kingdom. What you really say is that his son should have been his apprentice in wisdom, should have been as wise as he. There is a mistake, I think, that we can make in gathering all of the wisdom and understanding and so on that we can possibly gather to ourselves without sufficient thought of how do we apply that and how do we reproduce that wisdom and love and ability to be attuned in an apprentice or another who will carry the work forward. So for all the wisdom and the peace that the man brought to Israel, what he did not bring was a successor as wise as he. And of course, symbolically, the son of our experience is the result of our experience. So the experience itself was great for Israel. The result of it in becoming a living, established thing given to the people, he gave it to himself. He gave himself wisdom and perhaps even, in a sense, gloated at being or ambitiously desired to be the wisest man on earth. If I want to be the wisest man on earth, then I don't want to reproduce somebody wiser than me. It has been said that the greatest teacher is the one whose student excels him. And in fact, the relationship between Socrates and Plato is an illustration of that Socrates was not himself an initiate, but Plato was. And it's because of Socrates that Plato became an initiate, and by doing that he made Socrates' life greater than it might have been through his succession to him. It was that seems to be missing in the life of Solomon. And so it can be with us in growing. I can't tell you the number of people who want to come and sit and study, But if those people are told that studying in the school is building the school, then that becomes a different thing. I didn't come here to build the organization or the school or to make it work. I only want to collect this to myself, to bring it in. Well, what that really gives is indigestion, and it doesn't give birth to a successor that carries the work further and establishes the work. And I think that's probably what was missing.
This is a question in regard to preparing oneself as for the path of initiation through the steps that you before mentioned, mastering emotions and then mastering the mind and then the body. My question is, would it be beneficial? I've always heard like to prepare the temple, the earthly vehicle, through cleansing the body, through elimination diets, and then rebuilding again with primo nutrition. Would this be an aid in the first step of mastering emotions, or any steps along the way?
Yeah, it would be an aid to all the steps, any or all of them. It is a place to start. It may or may not be essential, depending on the individual. But somewhere along the way, there is going to have to be the purification and the rebuilding of the body, yes.
I believe I heard you make reference to the Old Testament as an example of karma, and the New Testament as grace. Is this correct?
Sort of. The word testament, by the way, means covenant. They are the same word. So we're talking about Old Covenant and New Covenant. And in a sense, there was a new covenant given through Jesus. That was a sort of updating of the Old Covenant, which didn't cancel the Old Covenant, but added a dimension to it. And that, in fact, that's not accurate either. To say that it added a dimension to it is not as accurate as saying that he restated a dimension that was already there had it been used. And that new dimension is grace, which essentially says that if I disobey the law, then the result of the disobedience will be my experience. I have set in motion a cause that will produce an effect. And what Jesus Christ added to that is, if after disobeying the law, I understand clearly my action, the cause that I have set in effect, and I turn my consciousness in a different direction, I become a different person from the one who broke the law, and I no longer owe the karma. And this was the law of grace.
So that Israel went through a series of breaking the law and experiencing the result of that, and then making a new covenant and breaking that. And
no, not really making a new covenant. The covenant remained throughout the time, even though it was broken many times. It was restated. Sometimes it was expanded because of the action of a particular individual. But it was not a new covenant given over and over. It was really one covenant throughout time, which still exists. Go ahead.
if the female, the feminine aspect, represents the intuitive nature, the receptive nature, our connection with Source, how is it that women, especially Hebrew women, were the inferior? Where does that originate? With what? I mean, why weren't they allowed to enter the temple, and why couldn't they be rabbis? And where does that come from?
Okay.
And still, you know, it's still a carryover.
The belief system is in the active and the passive roles, and the male was identified by the active role. He is the doer. The female is the incubator, And this was carried into not only the incubator in the physical, but the incubator in thought as well, so that even the relationship between Jesus Christ and Mary as two sides of a soul was that. He was the active, she was the one who took the actions, pondered them in her heart. She became the meditator, he became the actor, as the two sides of consciousness. So in a symbolic way, it has to be the priest that sets the action in motion. The priestess is the one who meditates and receives. She is the oracle, and he is the ritual actor. So he is the doer, she is the receiver, and those were the two parts of that relationship.
But that still doesn't explain why. I mean, to me, I'm not hearing why in ancient Judaism the woman was considered, impure and couldn't enter the temple. And I mean, still today in Orthodox Judaism, women are separated from men.
Okay.
And
That's not really a part of the religion or the covenant or the instruction from God. That's really a result of what happened between Cain and Abel. Remember that first action was that the active mind killed its passive counterpart. And so it was done in culture. I mean, that was a revelation of what we had done. We had made our intuition inferior, hid it in the tent. It gave birth to our children, but we didn't give it the credit. So action became superior to being receptive. So it wasn't a part of the religion, it was part of the culture, which built it into the religion.
We've been referring to mystery schools as rather formal sort of things where they were around a temple or something. I wonder, can initiate become directly involved with the Source or with the Holy Spirit and without going through a formal school as such?
Yes, definitely. An initiate can become an initiate without initially being a part of a formal school. However, as he reaches the appropriate levels in his growth, he will attract an initiator, so he still will have master teachers who appear in his life. But as far as a formal school, mystery schools of today are more often than not formal schools as far as having a physical plant. They are more like a confederation of teachers who share in the life of their student to the point of an initiation and pass them to another initiator in the next step, which may be in different countries actually. Okay, I think we're going to stop there. Tomorrow morning we will be talking about the mystical life of Christ. Now this will not be about the story of Jesus and will not cover the story of Jesus' life. The story of Jesus' life as the Christ will be done tomorrow night. So tomorrow morning is the mystical interpretation, tomorrow night is the life of Jesus as the Christ, and the two of those together I think will blend to the understanding of the Christ of the New Testament. And those will both be at the Fellowship Building over on 14th. So I hope to see you then. Good night.